Welcome to this Royal Irish Academy webinar on COVID-19 and the future of the arts. My name is Daniel Carey, and I'm a Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy and Director of the Moore Institute at NUI Galway. The immense challenges posed by the COVID-19 crisis have affected every area of society, and the arts and culture have been very hard hit, but they also represent a vital resource as an outlet, as a means of expression, as a source of consolation and inspiration. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by a distinguished panel with of people with leading roles nationally and internationally in Ireland, the UK, and Europe, whose work encompasses management of the arts and creativity and analysis of the impact of the crisis, assessment of trends and audiences, and engagement more generally. We want to try to think collectively about what we believe will and could change as events move forward. Today's discussion constitutes the first in what we hope will be a number of sessions that consider the arts and the impact of the crisis. We hope to convene artists and others in subsequent sessions and look forward to getting your thoughts on possibilities. You can participate via the chat function on Zoom. Before introducing the panel, I wanted to say a word about the series as a whole. This is, in fact, the 8th session in the RIA series, Perspectives and Pathways in a Time of Crisis. We have convened discussions so far on the science of COVID-19, economic questions, issues of social justice, the resilience of the higher education system, lessons from previous pandemics, and then in recent sessions, we've talked about vaccines and also vaccine acceptance. Recordings of these events are available on the RIA's website. I want to thank Jennifer Kennelly in the RIA for her help as ever. She's running things behind the scenes. So now to introduce our panel, which I'll do in alphabetical order. Tania Banotti is Director of Creative Ireland Program. Creative Ireland is an all-of-government program which began life as a well-being project. It also seeks to see how creativity and creative practice can be embedded across public policy, both in government departments and within local authorities. Tania previously ran the Institute of Advertising Practitioners of Ireland and worked in the arts for many years as Director of Theatre Forum. Maureen Kennelly was Director of Poetry Ireland from 2013 until she commenced her role as the Director of the Arts Council in April 2020. She was previously Director of Kilkenny Arts Festival, Artistic Director of the Mermaid Arts Centre, General Manager with Fishamble Theatre Company, and she also worked with the Druid Theatre Company, the Cat's Laughs Comedy Festival, the Arts Council, and the Design and Craft Council of Ireland. On a freelance basis, she worked with a wide range of organizations, including Theatre Forum, Sing Ireland, the Performance Corporation, and Age and Opportunity. She was primary curator with the Mountains to Sea DLR Book Festival and program director with the Courch International Festival of Literature. Nels Righolt is director of CKI, the Danish Center for Arts and Interculture in Copenhagen. He focuses on intercultural strategies, audience development, and cultural democracy. He is specialized as a cultural policy advisor and strategic consultant for authorities, institutions, and organizations in Denmark, the Nordic countries, and the EU. He has a broad background and experience for more than 25 years in the arts field as an artistic and managing director, curator and producer for arts organizations in Denmark and Sweden, and he is a board member of cultural institutions and organizations in Nordic as well as in a European context. And Torreggiani is the founder and CEO of the Audience Agency, the UK national charity for public engagement and participation. She is a specialist in audience strategy and research, trends and patterns in public engagement across the arts and in heritage. In the course of her career, she's worked with diverse groups from local authorities to national institutions and festivals, including the Tate, the National Theatre, and Manchester International Festival. She's also served as advisor to agencies such as the Arts Council England, British Council, and the European Commission. With Ben Walmsley, she is co-director of the new Centre for Cultural Value, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, based at the University of Leeds. Our respondent who'll be coming in at the end is Stephen Hadley. Stephen is a research fellow at the National University of Ireland, Galway. He's a visiting research fellow at the University of Leeds, associate lecturer at Leuphana University of Lüneburg, and an associate consultant with the Audience Agency. His book, Audience Development and Cultural Policy, is published by Palgrave Macmillan. So thank you all very much for being here. I'm sure you've been overwhelmed with responsibilities in the midst of the crisis. We're going to start with Maureen. Maureen, I wonder if I could begin by asking you a few questions about your experience and outlook. And I couldn't help but noticing you began your position in April 2020 with impeccable timing. So you have been at the thick of things right from the start. So Well, tell us a little bit about your take on the current moment and where you think things are headed for the arts.
Sure. Well, nice to be here and nice to see everybody. Thanks for having us. It seems very timely that we're almost a year into the pandemic now that the seminar is happening. So time to reflect for sure. And the line from Joni Mitchell's song, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone," is the one that was kind of ringing in most people's ears, I think, for the first 3 or 4 months. And I think that the arts came very quickly to occupy a central role in public discourse around the pandemic. And I think that was actually extraordinary. And I was very struck by many writers in particular were contacting me about a month in to say, "My God, I can't believe how much the arts is occupying airtime," which was good, of course, and continues to be good, I think. And not to be seeking silver linings where there aren't any, but the fact that the pandemic has struck so many sectors and has been so particularly cataclysmic for the arts, I think means that people have reached, and very quickly, a very good and deep understanding of what this profession is all about and what it needs. And it means that we are now in the Arts Council in the very good position of having just short of 60% more funding than we had when we, at the start of the pandemic. So our funding went from 80 million to 105 million last year, which was a very clear indication by the government that they understood the crisis that was facing the arts industry. And our funding this year is 130 million. So, we have been making the case to government that because of the particularities of the sector, it needs this extra investment, and that, in fact, while that's not enough, that will go will go very significantly to making sure that this sector comes through in one piece. So if that refrain from Joni Mitchell was in my head for the first 4 or 5 months, I've now reached a better position, I think, as we head into hopefully what will be a very successful and agile vaccination program. And it's a line from the late and very great Ivan Boland, one of our giants of poetry, who died unfortunately at the end of April last year. And she has a fantastic poem called "This Moment," and there's a great line in it: "Things are getting ready to happen out of sight." And that's the feeling that I have in my head, that things are there's a giant rehearsal period happening. And with this funding that we are dispersing along with other agencies, including Tania, of course, that there's a sense of a national rehearsal period that we're going into. And this is not to say that it's easy. Of course, it's extremely challenging for people, but when we can support people as we're able to do, that we can prime people that they're ready to come through this in a better state.
What kinds of things, what kind of measures do you think are necessary to do that? Obviously, funding is a key component of it, and that's reassuring, and it's a kind of lifeline under the circumstances. Do you think there are structural changes that need to take place? Is it more just retaining capacity to do something in order to act?
It's building capacity, and one of our most successful programs last year, and which we'll run again this year, is a capacity development program. So, recognizing that people couldn't make nor deliver or present work in the usual way, of course, because of the pandemic, it was to say to people, take time to reflect. And this is a time, where you've always been vaulting from one pressing deadline to the next. So actually stop and pause and think and use professional expertise out there to make sure that you can come through this better. And a major part of that was around enhancing digital capacity. So of course, we all know now that, we are consuming and experiencing culture in a very, very different way, and that people needed the means in terms of making and presenting work. So there's a huge amount of work going on in that regard. So that's a very practical application of it, and we'll continue to enhance our own digital expertise so that we can lead the sector in terms of how they will interact with the public. And of course, there will be no going back to business as usual. It probably will always be some sort of a mix from here on in, because this morning we were just on a call with the Irish Chamber Orchestra and with Spree, which is one of our great street spectacle companies in Waterford. And the Chamber Orchestra were reflecting on the massively increased figures that they've had in terms of the work that they have produced, you know, so that has been pleasantly surprising for many people. And this is never to ignore the fact that this can never replicate the real in live experience, of course. I think we would all accept that, but that there are many things that will be kept from this time. Allied to that, of course, there is the way in which we all live. And, you know, you have the phenomenon of many people returning to live closer to their home place, the fact that people will not live in cities to such a large degree. And this, in any event, we were embarked on our own spatial policy, but the pandemic has really taught us to reflect more on how we need to strengthen the infrastructure throughout the country, to look at the festivals and art centres, the arts officers, that fantastic necklace that we have throughout the country, and to see how we can ensure that we have a really strong core of artists and arts organizations in every pocket of the country. And that, you know, the pandemic has certainly accelerated our thinking in this regard, because we will also see how culture can regenerate those towns and villages that have been so badly hit, you know, and like I'm sure everybody's like me that, you know, we're obviously not moving far from home, and you're not seeing, you know, those centres that you were so used to, but obviously they've been decimated. So that, you know, it's going to need a huge injection of energy, and that will come from the arts and culture sector in spades to a large degree. So it will enhance yet again the role that the arts has to play in society, and that's exhilarating.
There's so many issues to pick up on, and I think we'll have a chance to circle back to them. But obviously, the spatial policy is rather interesting and suggestive. There's also dimensions of training that would be involved in that, the move towards the digital, how sustainable that is, but also even questions of broadband and its availability. There's so many implications of what you're saying. As I say, we'll come back to that. I want to turn now to Tania, if I might. And Tania, if you could say maybe by way of introduction a little bit more about Creative Ireland and the distinctive mission that you have, because it actually segues in interesting ways from some of the points that Maureen was making just there.
Sure, Dan. And I can't see the 123 participants, but can I just first of all acknowledge my privilege that I'm speaking to you as somebody who's getting a monthly salary as a public servant, and that there's probably lots of people on this call who are unemployed and really feeling, working in the arts and feeling very vulnerable and very frazzled. So just to say that, you know, we are here, I guess, talking about the policy and the framework, and I'm sure no doubt there'll be the voice of artists as we go through the discussion. But it might sound strange to say, but COVID was sort of the making of the Creative Ireland programme. And you might ask me what I mean by that, but when we started, we grew out, for those of you who have a memory of the 2016 commemoration, 500,000 people on the streets of Dublin for Easter week, and that huge year-long engagement in our history through the lens of culture and creativity. So when we began, and I wasn't there at that stage, but I remember getting my marching orders from the then Taoiseach, and he said, right, this starts out as a well-being project. The idea being that there is a lot of individual and collective well-being that comes from participating in creative and cultural activities, and that we feel that that should be open to everybody. And the second thing I want you to do is to think about creativity across public policy, that it is not something that is the preserve of just the Ministry of Culture, but how might the Department of Education think about arts and culture, the Department of Business. But just to focus, I guess, on the well-being piece, we had been working away for quite some time with what we describe as our culture and creativity teams in local authorities. And I suppose a lot of the people on this call will come from the arts, that dreaded in inverted commas phrase, but in Creative Ireland, we have a broader spectrum than that. Of course, it covers the arts, but it also covers heritage and libraries. And I suppose a more instrumentalist approach. So how do local authorities who've got challenges for people living in socially isolated situations, they run programs like Healthy Ireland and Age Friendly, and how can the arts and culture and creativity be valued more within local authorities and be seen to be something that would be necessary for the planning department and the water department? So you might say, what the hell has that got to do with COVID? But once COVID hit, those culture and creativity teams, by Jesus, did did they turn around? And some of them are on this call here. So I will simply take off my hat and say they stepped up. So we were asked to partake in a number of different government initiatives. The community call may be familiar to some of you. And we approached the Taoiseach's department and said, we feel that there's a gap in terms of things for older people living alone and people in nursing homes. And literally, I've never seen anything move as quick. Taoiseach said, right, do it. 6 weeks, get out there. For God's sake, we all need it. So Jennifer may probably start to pop in the comments box, just a sample of some of the things that we were doing. So we turned around to those culture and creativity teams and we said, what have you got? What could you turn around quickly for older people? And some really beautiful projects ensued. Things like mummers going to visit older people's homes, COVID care concerts. We've, I think we're up to 230 nursing homes now who have had visits from professional musicians who pivoted and brought the highest quality classical music and opera to nursing homes. We supported local authorities in some lovely, I suppose you'd call them commemorative projects, like the Kildare Notebook Project, where older people documented their lives. And in fact, we've done quite a few of those projects using the lens of the arts and creativity for people to document their lives and their experiences over the last year. And we're also working with the likes of the Irish Hospice Foundation for people to think about grief and bereavement and what they have experienced. So for us, these past year has been a point at which the things that we believed passionately, suddenly other people said, that is valuable, do more of it. So it's been very interesting. We've progressed conversations that I know I take my hat off to Maureen and the Arts Council have for 40 years done arts and health projects. So we are very much the Johnny come latelys. But I think the difference with Creative Ireland as an all of government programme is that we're trying to reach out to our colleagues in the HSE and the Department of Health who are doing a whole new mental health and wellbeing strategy and saying, where does the arts and culture and creativity sit in that strategy? That we cannot just be siloed over here in the Department of Arts. If we had an all of government that really valued what this can bring to the health of our people as well as the well-being, wouldn't that be something? So because of COVID, those conversations have really suddenly been greenlit in a way that it would have taken a long time otherwise. So when I think about will it change audience engagement, you know, obviously we've all pivoted. We did Crinú na nÓg, which is Ireland's day of free creative activities for children. We are the only country in the world to have a free national day of creative activities. And like everybody else, we pivoted. And like Maureen was saying, Jesus, anything we did got thousands of. We did a children's art competition, 8,000 children submitted. We worked with Fighting Words on a creative writing competition. We're still publishing the volumes of writings that we got. So we found that the challenge of having to go online has actually meant for some parts of the country, particularly Donegal, where we would have had difficulty reaching the outer parts of Donegal through the culture and creativity team, that for Crinú we got a lot more engagement. So as I say, without wanting to hog the floor, strange though it may seem, some of the things that we were doing suddenly got life and lifted off, and that's been really wonderful. So it's not to take away from the challenges that I'm sure all the participants on this call are facing, but I think that our goal of trying to get that well-being piece valued and recognized has really come ahead during COVID.
Thank you. I mean, there are a number of things again to come back to there, which we'll pick up when we resume in our discussion. Well-being as a kind of orientation, I think, is quite striking as a greater recognition. It almost becomes more tangible as a concept, I think, in the current moment. Really kind of definitions of heroism, which there've been attempts to embrace that and to articulate it in different kinds of ways. And we see different aspects of the society come forward and make contributions, but also redefinitions of community, I think, that are at stake in it in interesting ways. And I wonder now and Torreggiani, if I could come to you and talk to you a little bit about the sorts of research that you've been doing in the context of the Audience Agency and some of the trends and patterns you've been identifying, because I know the Audience Agency has been able to do research projects. So where do you think things are headed? What do you think what changes do you think we're going to see, and what changes should we see?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been sitting here musing on interesting Joni Mitchell quotes to kick off with, but can't think of one. So I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that I can't and move on to say, so yeah, so actually I was just thinking about, so yes, the audience agency, we hold quite a lot of the national audience data for the UK. And I suppose what that's given us is a bit of a sense about what was happening, but we've been running a very interesting population study at the moment. So this is not a survey of audiences, but of the population. And what's been really interesting, of course, is to look at, well, what have we known about audiences for a long time? And what can we now see the impact of the pandemic has been on behaviour patterns through the up and down lockdowns that we've had over the last year. What's kind of interesting to me, I suppose, there are lots of interesting things, of course, but what's most interesting, I think, is the idea that there are some long-term trends which in fact have been exacerbated or accelerated through the pandemic. And I want to just pick up on two of those in particular. I will say, actually, although we work a lot in the UK and we are funded by Arts Council England, Creative Scotland and Arts Council Wales, we do actually work in Ireland quite a lot. And there are some of these things that I think are very familiar. You know, so although I know I'm representing beyond these shores in a sense, there's a lot of parallels, I think. So the marked differences that I'm most interested in. So the first thing is that we've been aware in the data for quite a long time of a kind of growing difference between generations in their preferences and engagement patterns. And what I think we've seen through the pandemic, we actually look at the differences between younger and older audiences. I mean, there are some very short-term immediate things like, you know, younger audiences are, you know, more confident and more keen and snapping at the heels of the venues to open up and so on, all those things that we might expect. There are some very notable, in the UK context, some very notable differences between people in the big metropolitan centres and elsewhere. Not about rural, urban, but big metropolitan centres and differences, which I think is, you know, potentially quite interesting in Ireland as well. But I think the most interesting thing really is around responses to these sort of new digital offers that have just been, we just sort of chucked lots of digital stuff there. And one of the things that's I think is most interesting is not just about the fact that the profile of the audience for the overall online offering is much younger. So this is not because there's suddenly lots more young people engaging with culture. It's just that the overall profile has changed. It skews towards much younger audiences than we see for physical engagement. But here's the important thing, that what younger audiences are telling us they are interested in is not the same as what audiences are interested in online. So this is particularly interesting because I'm not sure that this is what individual organisations are seeing or are aware of. So what comes back quite clearly is that younger audiences are much less interested in kind of content that's just now suddenly, you know, nice high quality streamed versions of things that you could go and see in the physical space. Maybe you can go and see a national company that you wouldn't be able to see online. It's easier to get tickets and so they're not that interested in that thing. So clearly there is a big market for that and there are lots of people that are, but that is skewing towards that older audience, whereas younger audiences are saying they're more disappointed by those experiences and they're saying that they are more interested in much more immersive participatory forms of online engagement. So I think we have an issue where we are, if an individual organisation is looking through the narrow lens of what they're doing at how digital is changing what their future offer might look like, I think, you know, you're not necessarily going to get that very distinctive demographic fault line, which I think is really important. As I say, and this idea that people are talking about hybrid models, but what they mean is we might do some stuff online, some of the stuff we always do online, and we might do some stuff in the physical space, and that's a sort of hybrid thing. But I think we need to, so we really think we need to think about hybridity as being not just about where you stream your work, but actually how you make your work and how you use these new platforms to interact with audiences in a different way. So and I really think that that's going to be quite, as you say, I love this idea of this sort of giant secret rehearsal going on and then there's going to be this great explosion. I think that's true. I think that's really exciting. But I suppose what I'm concerned about is that we're learning from, this was a crisis that was going to happen anyway, this difference in appetite for more participatory forms of work and so on. So I think what I'm keen to see is that there is support for people that are willing to experiment and be bold in trying different ways of using these sort of new digital opportunities to make work in a different way, to make a different kind of invitation. And I think, so if I don't want to sound negative or gloomy, because I think lots of people have been doing it, and I think that fortune is definitely going to favour the brave in terms of reimagining what the interplay between being able to have a very direct conversation with somebody in a digital space and then what you can do in a physical space. And there's been lots, I think, of small scale experimentation around that. So I hope that people will seize the moment and start thinking differently about that. And I think if there are funding interventions that can help people to make those dive-off experiments work, so much the better. So I think that's the first thing. This gap between the baby boomers, where we as many cultural organisations they've got better at their marketing over time. They become more and more confident. They know that audience very well. They know how to plan for them. And of course, as we've become, in a sense, more audience centric, we've listened to that majority baby boomer audience much more. And I think we perhaps haven't been listening to a next generation who just isn't really there. They're not really part of our conversations. And suddenly, I think through pandemic, we've suddenly reconnected with small pockets of those people. So I think there's an opportunity for us to really think about what that looks like. So that's one of my predictions, is that we can really take off and start experimenting with a different conception of what we mean by digital. But we will need to make distinctions between, that's not just about having some better content for the BBC to get out there. This is a different way of thinking about it. So I think that's one thing, but I also really like this idea of that it may accelerate our refinding of our civic role. So I really like what Tania was saying. I think this is absolutely true. I think, again, organisations have massively stepped up. One of the other things we're seeing through the COVID monitor is that the pandemic, as we know in all other walks of life, has massively increased the inequalities and inequities for everybody. But that's also true in terms of cultural engagement. So those people that were already not engaging very much are engaging even less. What little offering has been taken up by super engagers rather than by those already. So there's already that we are seeing deficits. But again, I think individual organisations are working really hard to do something meaningful and useful in their places. And again, they've done that sort of against the odds, and in very challenging financial situations. So again, I'd love to see more support for that stepping up. And I do think there was, again, this trend, cultural organisations seeing themselves as being enablers of personal creativity as much as being, sort of passive audiences. I think that line has been breaking down. Again, I think there's a huge opportunity if we seize the moment to further erode that difference, to be enablers of creativity of a very wide range of people. And I think we've seen lots of amazing experimentation on that front as well. And I think people will feel encouraged and fortified by doing that. And if we can make sure that all the environment is encouraging you to follow up on that, rather than reverting back to the sort of the kind of providers of passive culture, I think would be very exciting. So my sense is that some good things are out there. I think that because of the terrible financial risks that people are taking and the responsibilities we feel towards our employees, everything we can do to make taking those risks safer is going to be very, very usefully done.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting. And I'm really intrigued by your focus on population-wide study rather than just on audiences, because there is obviously potentially something significant about that. The other thing just to pick up on is noteworthy is, I guess, that sense that we have to look at how these audiences are composed and whether there are some deeper trends and a move towards that. The emphasis generally has been on we're all in this together, but then we've also discovered that in lots of different areas of the society, we're not in it in the same way. We're not affected in the same way. So that's kind of emerging, I think, in some of your discussion. Nels, I wonder if I could turn to you now, and you're our sweeper, as we were saying. You're playing this interesting European role where you may speak for all Europe or Scandinavia, if you prefer a slightly smaller domain in which to discuss your interests and the sorts of things that you're seeing emerging.
Well, thank you, Dan, and thank you for inviting me. Sitting in Sweden, being Danish, I kind of see from, at least on the Scandinavian side, I see two same but quite different approaches to the current situation, at least. Both countries were obviously severely hit by COVID. Both countries' arts and culture sectors were severely hit, and the fragility of the cultural infrastructure emerged directly. We saw that the precariat of part-time workers, of the lack of sufficient insurance guarantees for artists, etc., was really bad. And we know that post-COVID, we will have to look very, very carefully into the structure in both Sweden and Denmark in terms of how can we create a much stronger much more resilient arts and culture sector that can meet a crisis. But as we all know, never waste the opportunities of a good crisis. And I think that's where we are now, about a year into the pandemic, that we have seen, obviously, organizations collapse. We have seen bankruptcies. We have seen lots of institutional and project-wide catastrophes. But we have also seen an art sector that has been able to bridge and to kind of diversify its own actions into other sectors. In Scandinavia, in Sweden and Denmark, about 80% of the annual turnover for the sector as such are public money. One way or the other, it's public money. And what's interesting is that it seems to be there seemed to be a much bigger interest in both countries in terms of private investors, private organizations, housing organizations, etc., to engage with arts and culture, to engage in arts and culture projects, and to use them as community facilitators. They have, as Tania kind of touched upon, they have artists across the country and cultural institutions across the country have achieved a much more visible, significant democratic role in their local communities than they might have had before, and than they might have been aware of before. There are differences in Sweden, where the country never closed down. We have never seen that kind of first restrictions that you have lived under in Ireland, and that my colleagues in Denmark still live under. So here the rhetoric around what is going on is very much about reopening society and re-entering the cultural structure as it was before. In Denmark, we're talking more about making use of the pandemic and the crisis as a kind of pause, and making use of that pause in terms of rethinking and reframing what we have to do. So that is a difference between how it's being perceived differently in the two countries. But I would say, in terms of how it connects into societies, if you look to Denmark, half the money are public money from a state level, Arts Council, the Agency for the Arts, etc. And half the money comes from the municipalities, and who has really stepped up are the municipalities. The municipalities have taken a very clear responsibility in trying to save their own local municipal cultural infrastructure, to support their artists that have kind of fallen between the chairs on a state level, have been rescued by local initiatives. We also see how housing organizations, for instance, go into collaborative, the formation of collaborative projects that are actually feasible in a time of restriction. In Copenhagen, for instance, we now see backyard theatre. Despite the cold, despite the winter, we see rehearsals outdoor for performances that will take place in the backyard, where people will be in social distance because they will be watching from their own windows around the backyard. So that kind of initiatives are being launched, not from the side of states or institutions, but from the side of housing actors and community actors and different kinds of organizations that influence things, and it's being funded locally, very often by the municipalities. I think one of the challenges we have in front of us is that we talk about transition, we talk about the need to reframe and rethink. But the more we get into the conversation with, for instance, the arts institutions themselves, the managers, the directors, what we hear is basically that they want it all to disappear, so they, with a magic touch of the wand, can get back to business as usual. Very few institutions are really profoundly trying to do something about this, trying to really meet the challenge and say, well, we cannot go back. There's no going back, none whatsoever. In reality, we will have to rethink our fragility, our financial structure, our business model has proven to be completely insufficient. The way we have negotiated contracts is insufficient. The way we have reported our connection into society and have structured ourselves has proven to be insufficient, and we have to think differently. But there are cases. I'll just give you an example of an institution that did it. It is the Danish Museum of Design, the Danish Design Museum. They chose to stay closed, no matter where COVID is going, no matter how many more waves we will see and how the vaccine will progress, they have decided to make use of the pause and to restructure themselves. They were one of the big successes in a kind of, new public management kind of way, selling a lot of tickets, having a lot of influx, having a lot of tourists, being ridiculously popular and be an absolute Instagram top-notch institution worldwide. But that's an insufficient way to build things when crisis hit. So they had to sack 70% of their staff because they lost the income that actually founded most of the capacity that museum had. So they were very, very severely struck. And it made them reflect, well, wait a minute, we are the Danish Design Museum. Our constituency are the citizens of Denmark. It's the citizens of Copenhagen. It's the design environment. It's about something else. We have to completely rethink our business model. We have to rethink our purpose. And we have to get into a dialogue with our funders, which in this case is the Ministry of Culture. And in doing that, they're risking everything, of course, because they are trying to say we cannot go back to be the Danish Design Museum as we was 2020 when the crisis hit. We have to be something else. And we don't know what that else will be. And this moment of insecurity is a golden moment. It's a moment where we really have the opportunity to redefine who shall we work with, who could we work for, what will be the strength of how we interact and define ourselves into our role in society in a longer context. And I think that's interesting. That's an interesting position. And interestingly enough, the Cultural Ministry didn't have an apparatus that could embrace it. Because here came one of the major institutions and challenged the apparatus, which is very repetitive, you have an agreement, you do what you're supposed to, you do your evaluation, and then that's about it. And then you get the next pay, the bucket of money. But in this case, they say, well, we can't do that. That's not good enough. Actually, we were a success, but we were a success on premises we should never have accepted. So there is this moment of this pause. Making use of the pause is something more and more people are saying. This morning, I had a conversation with a theatre director saying exactly the same. We have to rethink not just how we get out of it and how we strengthen our team in a post-COVID perspective. We have to rethink what we are actually doing and for whom we are doing it. So I hear community being addressed more often than I've ever heard it before. And it's being addressed from city theatres, municipal organizations, regional museums. They're all talking about community and trying to find out what is that. And how can they define community? They're talking about partnerships in a way I have never heard them talk about partnerships before. That partnerships, transversal partnerships, unusual partnerships will be more important in the future. They're talking about all the co-stuff, as Anne normally says. How can we collaborate and who should we collaborate with, and how can we identify the people we should collaborate with if we don't know them? How can we, for instance, in terms of interaction with artists, how can we bring the artistic perspective and the fragility of the artist into the structure of already public supported organizations so that we can help them off? They're not just paid for their project and then that's it. We can actually be part of something strong. I saw one of the questions that were posted in the chat. So all of these things are kind of up there. And what's interesting, just as a Scandinavian, where we have this huge tradition of welfare system, is that the inability from the side of the system to engage in the dialogue. The side of the system is basically talking about health packages. And yes, it's Scandinavia, and yes, they're generous, but still, that's not what is really needed. Health packages, yes, but the need is more about the formation of a new cultural policy, of a new cultural infrastructure, of a new cultural framework, a new way of working and supporting that. So maybe what we are seeing is the first little embryo of something that will replace what I would say has been a new public management guided and structured cultural sector for the last 20 years.
That is really fascinating. There's so many themes to pick up on there, and just to make some connections with points that came up earlier, your emphasis on municipalities and the role that they were playing, very interesting in relation to what Tania was talking about, and the connection, the intense connection with the local, which in one way is paradoxical because it's also a digital moment where we transcend the local, at least in theory. So that's really interesting, but also picking up on that element of experimentation that I think is implicit. The pausing and rethinking of possibility that I think Anne was also referencing experimentation as what scope is there for that. So, right, well, we'll kind of reassemble now as a group and try to take a few questions and things that have come in. One of the questions I wanted to start with, and I wonder if Maureen, you might, this is a difficult one, but to address, which is the question of universal basic income has been raised. And I'm sure that that's something which is, and you're all in different ways in interesting positions because you're almost in the middle to a certain extent. You're both dealing with those who consume culture and who value it and care about it and want it to be available to them, and those who produce it under the immensely difficult circumstances, which got so much more difficult. So I just wondered, Maureen, if you might comment on that and how that argument is developing perhaps in an Irish context.
Yeah, well, it's a very live argument in the Irish context, and we were part of the Cultural Recovery Task Force, which it's its main recommendation, and that was unanimous. I think there were 26 of us in the task force, and within the course of the first meeting, we had all absolutely agreed. That was a mixture of artists, arts managers, policymakers, and so on. And I think there is real heft behind that proposal now. The Minister for Culture is very much supporting it with her government colleagues, so we're hopeful that a pilot scheme may arise from that. And that really exposes, the fragility of the arts sector and what Fintan O'Toole, one of our premier journalists, has talked about, the underlying condition of the arts, that coming into the pandemic, it was underfunded, very neglected in many ways, and that the pandemic, then the cataclysmic effect, has absolutely exposed that to wider society. So this is why it's so welcome now that government is actually recognising that wider society is saying, okay, actually, we now get it. We get that this sector, which has delivered so much to us all our lives, is actually desperately underfunded and needs the sort of initiative like universal basic income in terms of properly elevating it to the position that it deserves. So the fact that it is such a rich part of Irish society further makes the argument for UBI. And we've obviously been looking to other models in Europe where it has worked extremely well. So I think that I hope very much that it may, that the pilot may get lift off sooner than we all think. In fact, I think that there's huge support in terms of, it's interesting, I just saw one of your correspondents said, talking about local authorities, and yet that has been another important discussion point in the Cultural Recovery Task Force, where there was a big fear that their investment wouldn't hold up. And thankfully, I think it has in the main this year. But also just to say that local authorities have brought forward interesting schemes, which I think will be very innovative in terms of outdoor space. So there's evidence, not just beyond, aside from the funding, there's evidence of imaginative thinking that has real collaboration at its heart. So I think that all these things bubbling up together are going to be actually very beneficial for the arts in Ireland.
Yeah, I think that obviously there's a key question of funding, and that's coming through in questions about whether we think the funding will it go up? Will it go down? There might be that opposite response, that look, there's so much demand for in the spaces of the society for recovery and sectors of the economy that are so badly affected. Tania, I wonder if I could ask you a little bit about that question of sustainability. And you've done a number of innovative programs during this moment in time. Do you think that they're likely to remain embedded in the system in some way? Can that be a resource to us in the future in making the case for again, this kind of intensely local relationship to the arts, that it's embedded more fully in the priorities, both of councils, but of really fundamentally the society as a whole?
Well, for the local authority piece, I mean, we did a review with the CEOs of the local authorities last November, right in the midst of all of this. So we were really encouraged that the CEOs said, we really like the Creative Communities programme of Creative Ireland. We wanted to continue beyond 2022. So I have to travel, hopefully, in that respect. that local piece, and you know, I can see that Kate Kennelly and some of our coordinators are on the call, so they may want to say something about that. To answer JP McMahon about the funding, I think it's going to be very challenging. JP, you know, I think poor Maureen, I feel for you, Maureen, because obviously to have an increase of 55 million in a year is really, really needed and really welcome. And probably, I think, the largest increase for any state agency in the history of the state. So it'll be really a big political challenge, I guess, to secure that as the new normal. That everybody will be fighting for that, but you know, that is definitely going to be challenging. I think the government's Living with COVID published yesterday had a couple of kind of lines about, you know, and once things start to improve, we will have to look at the public finances. So without question, there are challenges ahead. But look, let's hope that this is the new normal and let's fight for that.
That's a very interesting question, because there was an EU report that was released today that Stephen Hadley was drawing my attention to. And it really strongly emphasizing the question of sustainability, which is sort of the word of the moment. And it's become that much more acute as a kind of question and challenge. That's why I think, Nels, your perspective on pausing experimentation is quite interesting, because in a moment in which there's an existential crisis of survival, almost seems totally inimical to the possibility.
And Nels, I'm just thinking, like, nobody, unless Maureen, it occurs to you, nothing comes to mind of any big national institution or art centre that said, right, I'm just stopping and I'm completely rethinking. But I guess everybody, you know, from the venues that Maureen funds that, you know, may be closed until September for all we know, how might those venues repurpose? How might they offer their rehearsal spaces? How might they change their model? I'm assuming that a lot of the people on this call are thinking about that, but very few of them, Nels, have had the courage to go, that's it. We're just pressing pause here. Nobody here, as far as I know, has done that.
Well, it wasn't without cost, or it hasn't been without friction either. The director for the Danish Design Museum is constantly in the media defending the position, obviously. But she's getting a more and more visible support from the arts and culture sector, because what she really highlights is basically the necessity to replace her institution in a democratic context, instead of having it in a financial tourism context, or you know, really saying, well, it's a design museum serving a constituency. It's not serving the once in a lifetime tourist. Even though that might give us a financial muscle, it's not sufficient enough to really please the core of what we're doing, which is about placing arts, artifacts, design, the conversation about design, the conversation about culture into a Danish context. There isn't kind of, the discourse is shifting here, but she's still being regarded as utterly brave and some would say kind of stupid. but what I like about it, coming back to your question, Dan, is that what she's doing is she's saying this is an unwelcome break to rethink. And I think from an institutional point of view, that's something that has really inspired a lot of institutions over here. But people are saying, well, this is what it is. Even though we have staff on furlough and we have had to let go of people, and we are in a situation where even in a post-pandemia perspective, we do not know the scale of our income. We do not know the scale of our future capacity in a 2, 3, 4 year perspective. There's so much insecurity. This pause is still good for something, and it's good for something that is internal about how we work, with whom we work, and how we organize ourselves. And I think that's really promising. Another thing that, if you're coming to the European, another thing that came out, I had the privilege of speaking to Barbara Gassler, who's the head of the European Office for Creative Europe, just a few weeks ago. And she highlighted that in the conversation with the national arts councils, but also the national cultural ministries, they have seen a need to kind of speed up the support in the forthcoming project. So from a European perspective, they see this lack of funding, this lack of free money that has made them redirect the structure of the Creative Europe program in a way that the majority of the money in the coming 5 years will be released in 2021, 2022. So they will actually then slowly phase it out. So there will be more money this year and next year as a way to support local and national initiatives across Europe. Of course, the Creative Europe money are actually quite few in a big perspective, but it's a signal that we might have to think differently in how we distribute support, both transnationally, but even nationally between the regions and the municipalities. And that is being listened to here.
That's a great question, and obviously connects with the work, Tania, you're doing at that European level in terms of policy. And I wonder if I could come to you again and ask a question which has come up in the chat about the digital divide, and which is, I think there's awareness of, but fully what its implications are and how we respond to it. And I think I'm asking you about this partly because you raised this interesting question of a different pull, if I can put it that way, in different aid groups, different levels of expectation, some of which are predicated on digital means of access and participation. So, I mean, is that something you've worked on or thought about, the question of the digital divide and its implications? Thank you.
I was just crafting a response to that, actually, which I will now not do, but I think that's absolutely right. I mean, obviously, you know, digital poverty is a major factor, and that we can't ignore. But I also think that it's not just, you know, it's not just people that don't have access to anything, which is actually quite a small, you know, it's a small percentage of the population. But I think it's also that different, you know, different people with the haves and have-nots use digitally very differently, and we need to be aware of that. So there's been some really amazing projects where people have used WhatsApp as their main platform, which has been, you know, really revelatory. But it's a real thing, and I think that because I think that without very much data at their fingertips and with quite a lot of anecdotal information, I think a lot of organisations are assuming that digital equals better access and digital equals more egalitarian spread. I'm hearing people saying it all the time, but I'm telling you that that in that data, it is very clearly not the case. So actually, at the moment, collectively, our digital offering is helping the haves, not have-nots. So I think we do, as I say, but there are some amazing, I keep hearing every week, I hear some amazing stories about people who've found great workarounds because they know their community really well, and they're talking to them and they're co-designing what those experiences look like, and they don't look like anything they've done before. I think also, you know, for the sort of people who work in, you know, socially engaged arts and who are working very much that sort of community arts way, have assumed for quite a long time that digital is not really for them, you know, that actually it's a very face-to-face kind of experience, and that's what matters, and that's how you build trust. And I think one of the big, I mean, you know, we've done a lot of work with our colleagues in the Creative People and Places network, which is a lot of linked projects that work in that way, about how many amazing lessons about how how actually the digital space, if used in the right way, can open up all sorts of new conversations, can be sort of stress and anxiety reducing factor, but you've got to do it in the right way. And of course, that, you know, it is in their DNA to be very collaborative in how they've done that. But I think that they are offering, you know, that's really beacon important work for the rest of us to look at. And in one of my other comments, I thought, you know, actually, we've seen, again, some great successes from some of the big brand names. I mean, everybody is talking about National Theatre at Home, and it's amazing, and everyone loves it. But, you know, actually, you can't have many of them. That is not an option for most cultural organisations. You can't have thousands of those. You can, you know, I mean, it is. We have all got to look at using the learning that we've just been able to have at whatever cost, and we all need to kind of plug into what our particular community, and then we may need to redefine what that is, but how we use these sort of new channels and ways of working to reach them. But I think the co-design principle, that we don't copy what other people in the sector do, that we work with our communities to do it, is must have.
And it might be interesting to ask the 120 people on this call, what do they want done differently? You know what I mean? I'm sure they probably have particular asks of Creative Ireland or the Arts Council in terms of processes, and that's reasonable. But there might be other things that, you know, if everybody here is thinking about, well, what would I do differently myself, or what would I seek to be different in the world that I work in? It might be just interesting for people to put that in the chat function.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we can provide the whole point is to provide a form of stimulus for conversation. So we're happy to try to find different ways of channeling it. I think, Anne, your point is quite interesting about co-design, partly because of its creative dimension, because we don't know what will come from co-design. Presumably that's part of the premise of it, is that it is creative, unpredictable in that sense, which is very attractive. Stephen, I wondered if we could come to you and for some thoughts on giving a shape to this fascinating discussion we've had. This is an impossible burden to put you under. I apologize for doing it, but you've had a chance to listen to some of the contributions here, and what's your take on the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating actually, and trying to summarize it's going to be enormously difficult. So I'm going to riff on Maureen's opening Joni Mitchell quote and just say we've looked at life from both sides now, and I think that kind of informs a lot of the way that we see this. I've been in so many conversations recently with various different elements of the sector, and it feels to me, and a kind of summary of what we've talked about today, that your journey into COVID in many ways determines your journey out of it, and that we carried in structural inequalities, we carried in precarity for freelance workers, we carried in poor levels of pay, we carried in digital divides, we carried in questions around cultural value and community engagement and the purpose of the sector, and we will carry those out again. And the way that, you know, our entry determines our exit in some ways, because it feels like within the conversation we've had today, those ideas around value, the ideas around infrastructure and inequality, that kind of interesting dynamic or dialectic that had started to develop between these ideas of creativity, culture, and the arts are still all playing around there in terms of where we come out from this. What's really interesting as well, I think, is that we're going to be exploring for some time this notion of whether we're building back, or whether we're building back better, or whether we're building new, or whether we're leveling up, or which of those kind of construction metaphors we want to go with. I was having a conversation with somebody from another arts council yesterday who said, yes, we do want to build back better, but we're looking at the biggest drop in GDP since the Napoleonic War, which kind of put it in really stark kind of terms for me. So I think as much as we need to care both for people who work in the sector, what I think we've seen, and it's that kind of, just to riff on art and culture, is that we've seen a cultural reset, because if we can even remember what it was like before COVID, we were living in this kind of late capitalist scenario. So many people I spoke to said, you know, it's like running on a treadmill and trying to catch your breath, and like, you know, when was the last time I went for a walk in a park because I was so busy? And we've had a cultural reset in the, not just in terms of our engagement with art, but our engagement with nature, our sense of communities, our sense of speaking to our neighbours. And I think the great challenge going forward, which we've talked about in interesting ways today, is ensuring that that cultural reset is actually built back into our systems for the sector as we go forward. So I'll stop there.
Oh, that is, I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. I think that does seem to be the challenge. There's so many valuable points have been made today that we want to retain and to try to work with. Naturally, it's difficult if you're in the midst of a hurricane holding on to things. There's that element of it. And there are people who are asking extremely basic questions about their own kind of ability to survive under the conditions and where they have to work, and so that they can continue to make a contribution in the domain in which they'd like to make it. We've obviously heard of that community dimension and the work that Tania is doing, the wider sector, where there's this welcome support. Will it continue in the future? How will it be sustained? How will we make sure that new audiences are engaged? How can we work with the possibilities of different kinds of platforms? While also in the European document I was mentioning references well-being, which is obviously a significant notion, but also social innovation and social cohesion. These don't always pull in the same directions, and some of the implications aren't socially cohesive. There's also an implicit potential for competition within the society. I think there's a sense we've all tried to work together towards a common aim, but when the plague is over, what will happen and where will those competitive forces go? There's so many questions, I think, for us to confront. I just wanted to thank everybody, your participation today, to the audience for joining us, fantastic contributions in the chat, which we'll be looking at and reflecting on further. But just to say a word of closing, just to thank once again Anne, Maureen, Neil, Stephen, and Tania for a fantastic contribution. So much to think about and a real platform for further reflection and indeed action. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.